I'm going to talk today about software and food, not the usual term of dog fooding, which is kind of a pretty gross way to talk about using the software yourself that you also write. I'm going to talk more about analogies between dietary choices and software choices. And this talk was part of the building community track here. So what I'm interested in is learning what the free software movement can learn from other social movements generally, but in this case specifically from vegetarian and vegan movements. So this was inspired a lot by a book I've been reading called The Bloodless Revolution. That's a very dense book. It's dense history of the vegetarian movement, but it's raised a lot of really interesting ideas about a movement that's been going on for a very long time that can be of interest in looking at a movement that's going on for has been going on for a much shorter period of time, like the free software movement, only about 32 years so far. So I've heard this analogy before, but I don't remember exactly when I first heard it. But I feel like it's something that pops up periodically. Is free software vegan and open source vegetarian? Has anybody else heard this before this talk? No. Okay. So I searched on the web to try to find so I could credit who first kind of came up with this, but I haven't been able to locate it. I know that I was not the one that invented it. One thing I can tell you is, before we start, is that the FSF's mission is definitely not to promote veganism or vegetarianism in particular. At the Free Software Foundation, we're concerned with promoting free software to people of all types of political beliefs and lifestyles. But I personally have been vegan for about 18 years, and on the FSF staff, we currently have 3 vegans. And as the executive director, I do get to do the hiring, but no, really, it's not on the required qualifications list. And there are times over the years, I've been at the FSF for about 13 years now, and there are times when I have been the only vegan. It goes, up and down just like it does in anywhere else. But there has been a lot of crossover between the FSF and food. And don't forget that the free software movement does love animals. We stepped back and looked at how many of our mascots and our program's logos are animals. So it's kind of fun to look at this and see how many you can guess. And this image is several years old now, so I think we need to do some updating on it. But there's no intrinsic connection, I don't think, between free software and animal rights. But in the area of copyright, which is central to free software, RMS, Richard Stallman, our president and founder, has over the years often drawn an analogy between the ridiculousness of controlling software through copyright restrictions and what that would look like in a recipe. And imagine if you went to a restaurant and you got a recipe from a chef and you just said, "How can I take out the salt?" And the chef told you, "You're not allowed to take out the salt." And if you said, "Well, I have to take out the salt because my doctor says I have to eat less salt," the chef's like, "Well, you're not allowed to do it. I can do it for you. But it'll cost you, and I'll get around to it, when I get around to it, because right now I'm busy with some other projects." When we talk about the area of food and diet, that seems clearly wrong. It's a bad way to treat people. People should be able to get instructions for how to make a dish from somebody else and then modify it to suit their tastes. So already for a long time, there's been an intersection between the way that the FSF has explained free software and food as an analogy. But let's look back at the original analogy, and kind of walk through it, see how the Tofurky is made, so to speak. Is. That's the first word. Depends what the meaning of the word is. Thank you, Bill Clinton. No, I think we can skip over the word is and get to free software. It's free software. So free software is defined by 4 freedoms. The freedom to run the program for any purpose, the freedom to study how the program works and change it to do your computing as you wish, freedom to redistribute copies so you can help your neighbor, and the freedom to distribute copies of your modified version to others so that they can benefit from your changes. Or if it's my code, so you can be hurt by the bugs as badly as I am. Vegan is free software vegan. Veganism is the practice of abstaining from the use of animal products, especially in diet. And there's certainly not a lot of there's disagreement about where the boundary is. So, for example, I eat honey. If you read the vegan forums on the web, you can find many holy wars about whether that means I'm not a real vegan or not. People draw their lines in different places. Some are strictly dietary vegans, but wear leather clothing, things like that. But we know that the basic difference between veganism and vegetarianism is that veganism also avoids anything that comes from an animal or is an animal product, whereas vegetarianism is normally about just eating the animal directly. Open source has a longer definition than free software, but if you look at these 10 tests that code's terms of distribution have to pass in order to be considered open source, they are pretty similar to the free software definition. So code has to be freely distributable, it has to have the source code available, and also be distributable in binary form. Derived works have to be allowed. So you can have some measures to protect the integrity of the original code as long as it's legal to distribute patch files to that code. Can't be any discrimination against particular people or groups or fields of endeavor. The license has to be distributed clearly with it. Can't be specific to any one product. Can't restrict other software on the same system or distribution media, and has to be generally technology neutral. So if you can kind of really collapse these things into different parts of the free software definition, like no discrimination fits pretty well under freedom to run the program as you wish. So they end up actually referring in practice to the same software, which is where we run into why this analogy is interesting to look at, because why are they different? Why is free software different from open source if the terms are essentially the same? And even the very specific lists of licenses that meet the free software definition and meet the open source definition are, in practice, the same. You'll find a couple that meet the open source definition that don't meet the free software definition, but they're cases that are not in use, really. And for purposes of thinking about this, there's no point in focusing on those differences. There is actually a vegan software license. Sorry, skipped over. What is vegetarian? We already explained this. So vegetarianism is focused on not eating the actual direct animal most of the time. Of course, another way to refer to vegan is strict vegetarian, so it just takes it a little bit further. There is a vegan software license, which I learned while putting together this presentation, actually. So it's free software, except for you agree that you are not developing or manufacturing products which involve testing of any sort on animals. You're not participating in the animal testing industry. You're not producing any products that involve animal byproducts. You're not doing anything with GMOs that are from animals. You're not involved in the rodeo or animal breeding or transportation of animals, and it goes on off the bottom of the screen, but you get the idea. This is the EXTJS license. So this is an example of a license which is neither free software nor open source, because it discriminates against fields of endeavor on the open source definition, and it restricts your ability to run the program for any purpose by the free software definition, because if you're in the rodeo, you're not allowed to run the program. So this is vegan, but not free software. So I wanted to sort of frame this by talking about the reasons that people choose vegetarianism or veganism, because I think that's what the analogy really tries to speak to. If the software that's open source and the software that's free software are the same thing, then the analogy is talking about the reasons behind distributing or developing the software, rather than differences between different kinds of software. And in the vegetarian and vegan movements, people make the choice to stop eating animals or animal products for a variety of reasons. One popular one is the environment. People, and I'm going to give these reasons. I'm going to present these reasons, not to advocate for you to change to being a vegetarian or vegan, but to present them as vegetarians or vegans look at them and why they make their choices. So animals have to eat grass, and grass has to be, animals have to eat plants in order for you to eat the animals. Growing the plants consumes resources, so if you're going to use the resources, why not just eat the plants directly instead of raising the animals first or eating them? Farms have pollution runoff, from fertilizer, pesticides, things like that. So a powerful reason for people cite, a common reason that people cite for making this choice is to help protect the environment and to use less resources. There's also some sustainability arguments that would probably fit under this too, that a meat-based diet is not sustainable for the full world's population as a plant-based diet. Another reason is just taste. And we have actually Matt Lee, who drew the picture of all of the different animal mascots for free software. His reason for being a vegetarian is because he thinks meat is gross. So this is not anything in particular about the environment or other issues. It's just that some people find meat distasteful. They don't like it, so they don't eat it. Health. Meat's bad for your heart, causes cancer, all the things that there's debate about, but people hear is a very common reason. Religion. Religions like Buddhism can a lot of people interpret to mean requiring a certain type of vegetarianism, although the Buddha actually, according to the stories, died from food poisoning from eating pork. Meat industry excesses is kind of a clumsy name, but the reason that I've heard a lot where people don't necessarily object to the act of eating animals or animal products, but they object to the way that in countries like the United States, meat is produced and distributed. So maybe if you had a farm and you had your own chickens and they laid eggs and you ate them, maybe that's okay, but factory farmed chickens and their eggs are something that people object to in particular. We have the Freegan, which is basically eating anything that is free, not going to go to stop food from going to waste. And I'm listing this here because I think it fits. So it's usually people who, when they purchase food, purchase only vegetarian or vegan food, but they will eat anything that looks like it's going to go to waste. So it's like vegetarianism with specific exceptions. And then ethics, which is usually presented as if you're not going to kill people, then you shouldn't kill animals either, and it's just ethically wrong to eat animals. And then the vegan version, taking it a little bit further, is that it's ethically wrong to confine animals and force them to produce stuff for you, like eggs. So I was stepping through these reasons and kind of thinking about each one of them applies to software choices. Both these movements have the common characteristic that they're about choices that individuals make, and both to engage in certain types of behavior and to avoid certain types of behavior. So if you're a vegetarian, you avoid eating meat, and you engage in different things to advocate for that choice with other people. So the environment reason, I think we do find a parallel with software, and that's that software, the terms under which software is produced most of the time create a kind of software culture. And the nature of that culture impacts people whether they're programmers or not. And I think it's sort of similar to the resource use position with vegetarianism or veganism. So even if you're not a programmer, you benefit when people who do write code have the freedom to modify and redistribute code that they come upon. And it's similar to if you think about a free press. You don't own a newspaper, probably, or publish your own news magazine, but you benefit from laws and constitutions which prohibit censorship because you get better information as a reader, as a person. And similarly, you can make the argument for free software that whether each individual is going to actually modify code or not, the culture under which that software is distributed when those terms are free benefits individuals and is essentially ends up being a better use of the resources that are programmers and the time that they invest in their code. We can also see now that proprietary software can have a very direct impact on the environment. So scandals recently like Volkswagen, or now apparently Daimler Chrysler, I think, were using proprietary software to cheat emissions tests so that the cars could pass, and then as soon as they got out on the road, the software would recognize the different conditions and crank the engine up and emit more things that they're not supposed to be emitting. So free software does have also a direct connection to the literal reason of potentially of environment and resources, but I think also that metaphor applies. But I have to say, don't call it an ecosystem. So this is something that Richard Solomon wrote on GNU.org, just to make the point that even though we can see a parallel between the world under which and the conditions under which software is produced We have to remember that it's different from the world of nature, in that when we talk about humans, we're talking about moral prescriptions and things that you ought to do or ought not to do, and individual agencies, so that we can convince people to change their behaviors. And I can see his point that that's different from when you're talking about an ecosystem, talking about plants growing in certain ways and interacting, and there's really not much potential to talk to the plant and convince it to behave differently, whereas we can talk to fellow programmers and computer users and try to influence their behavior. The taste reason for being vegetarian, I take to mean an argument we hear often in free software, that you should use free software because it's better, it works better. It's easier to use, it's prettier, it tastes better, right? Regardless of the social implications. And this, each one of these reasons kind of leads us down a different path as far as what types of advocacy we'll do, what priorities we emphasize. And if we're focused mostly on the taste reason with software, we tend to prioritize actions like putting money into free software development in order to make sure that the software actually is better. In order to make sure that Inkscape is better than Illustrator, that GIMP is better than Photoshop, that the desktop is prettier than the Mac desktop, those kinds of things. And I will say that as a vegan, this has been one of my primary methods of advocacy, which is just to learn how to cook and be able to prepare food for people, to show them that it doesn't all have to taste like stale quinoa. It can be tasty. And so you can see how giving people a program that works really well is a good way to get them interested in free software in general. And the FSF certainly brags about free software when it's good. But we also try to convince people to still stick to using free software and avoid proprietary software when it's maybe not as good. And there's a good talk, I think you can find video online, by one of our board members, Mako Hill, who is also a professor at the University of Washington, and he has a talk called When Free Software Isn't Better, and kind of addresses this question directly. So I recommend that for thinking more about this area. But I think another aspect of the taste concept is the meal plan. Okay, and this is something, one thing that people complain about with vegan food and vegetarian food is why do we need tofu dogs? Why do we need veggie burgers? Why do we need fake chicken nuggets? What's the deal with the focus on producing vegetarian meat equivalents? Why not just produce tasty vegetables or plant-based protein, in its native form instead of processing it into something? And I think that the taste issue explains part of this, because it's not just the taste of the individual bite of food you're having, it's the concept of what makes up a meal. So we have veggie burgers because when you eat at a barbecue with your friends that are omnivores, you can have a burger too, along with the potato salad and the chips and dip, and you now have, you have a meal by the traditional definition of a meal, which has this meat, fish, poultry category as one part of it. So I think taste is not just about how the food tastes. Taste has to do with the expectations of what constitutes a full meal. Now, how does that apply to software? What does it mean when somebody says a program is easier to use, or works better for them, or looks nicer? Sometimes it seems pretty objective, but sometimes it seems like it's more a matter of expectations, that it's what the software they grew up with. They expect a desktop to work in a certain way because the first desktop they learned on was Windows, and so they want the desktop to work similar to Windows. They want the meal plan to look roughly the same. And in order to make it look the same, free software developers and advocates might focus on kind of the meat replacement method of advocacy and initiatives, which would be, there's, for example, the project that's made GIMP look exactly like Photoshop, right? Like gave GIMP the Photoshop style interface, because even though GIMP had largely all the features that Photoshop had, people who were trying to transition from Photoshop had a hard time because the interface worked completely differently. So somebody just took the GIMP code and put a different interface on it to help match the Photoshop interface. Or there's been some movements, for example, in the GNOME desktop, to try to have some of the same features that the Mac desktop has. Of course, that's also gone the other way. We've seen some Mac features that seem to be coming from GNOME. So this isn't just a one-way thing here, but I think we can, if we think of our free software world as using a program as a meal, then focusing on tastes takes us down a certain path. And one thing it takes us away from is we don't spend as much time criticizing or highlighting the negatives of proprietary software. You will, if you're concerned about taste and appealing people's taste, you'll want to put more of your focus on making the program that you're trying to get them to use really good, addressing their reasons for it, any reasons they might have for not liking it, and you'll want to focus on giving them a similar experience to what they're used to a lot of times. You want to challenge their taste buds too much all at once. But people who care less about taste and more about some of the other issues might want to focus on different approaches. So instead of making replacements for proprietary programs, they might want to focus on, well, this is how the desktop looks now, but is there some radically completely different method of organizing programs and files on a computer and a connected network that we might want to pursue, even if people are going to look at it at first and be like, I don't know what that is, but I don't want to touch it. So different priorities on this issue lead to very different directions. Health is another popular reason for choosing to be a vegetarian. And in free software, and software in general, I think of health as being the security of your computer and the way the computer and the software interacts with other things you're concerned about, like your privacy. So in a way, it's similar to taste in that it implies something about how well the program works in certain areas, but I think this is a specific category that people focus on. And it's a powerful argument, especially since Edward Snowden blew the whistle on a lot of bulk surveillance. It's called attention on what software might be doing behind your back. And this reason does lead us to criticize the shortcomings of proprietary software a lot more. So it leads us to point out that if you can't see the code, or somebody who understands code can't look at it for you, it could be doing anything and pretending to be doing something else. It's bad for your computing health. And the FSF definitely focuses some on this reason. We have the email self-defense guide, which helps people get started using email encryption with GNU PG. And it's a way to protect their health as a person interacting with other people. So much like the environment too, free software and proprietary software can have very direct effects on your health, not just metaphorically, but some of you might know Karen Sandler, the executive director at the Software Freedom Conservancy. She has a heart device which runs proprietary software, and she has a lot of concerns about that. So you can look up some of her talks and hear more about that. But the inability to examine the source code that is in your body, supposing for the purpose of helping to address a medical condition, that's terrifying. And so we're thinking here not just about analogies for free software and diets that improve your health, but ways in which free software actually directly impacts people's health. Religion, popular reason people choose to be a vegetarian. Well, Emacs versus Vim. I don't know if that's the best one I could come up with for this. You probably know where we stand on that. I think there probably are some religious reasons for choosing free software. There have definitely been some religious flavors of different GNU Linux distributions. There are definitely some Christian groups that produce their own versions of GNU Linux. And I think that religious guidelines about community behavior for sharing and helping your neighbor probably do, if people were to look at software issues in those terms, would probably steer people towards free software and away from proprietary software. But I don't know anybody that's chosen free software for this reason. I know people that are very religious who choose free software, but generally not because of anything that they view as directly coming from their religion. Industry excesses, like the factory farming. I think that there is a version of this, and that's it's one that, as a society, I think we leap to pretty quickly, because it's about a recognition that software can do bad things, but the solution to it doesn't necessarily have to be a world of all free software. It can be just more checks and controls on software that's distributed. So I think this is a common government reaction to issues that come up, also a common corporate reaction to issues that come up. So the companies like Google, Facebook, who saw what happened with the reaction to Snowden and people being more concerned about their privacy, and their reaction to that was, partially helpful, but very focused on getting the government to rein in its surveillance behavior. So to be able to stand up to government requests for information better, to be able to disclose when the government asks them for information, and those things are, arguably good for sure, but they didn't address the corporation's involvement in creating the conditions that allowed all this information to be collected and easily accessed by government or people who just broke into their systems. So if you were concerned about free software, if you're concerned about software ethics just because of the specific bad things that software does commonly, then you might move to solutions that focus on just those specific bad things rather than on more wide, radical types of changes. I think we do have the Freegans in free software, which is they object to free software, but not so much that they won't use it, just that they don't pay for it or give any tangible support to it. So preference for free software if they actually feel like they're directly contributing to it, but if it's just there to download and use, well, they might just do that. So we saved ethics for last, because that's the one I wanted to talk the most about. There's many different reasons for ethical arguments for free software, and I think kind of covering all those and the different ethical systems that they arise from is a topic that deserves a full talk on its own. So I just wanted to highlight a couple. This is one of the most compelling ones for me from Eben Moglen, and it's even about food. So the bold part here, if you could feed everyone on Earth at the cost of baking one loaf and pressing a button, what would be the moral case for charging more for bread than some people could afford to pay? So software has zero marginal cost. Once the program is distributed, it can be distributed again to everybody at no cost. So if software is useful and helpful to people, and there's no cost in distributing it, then what is the possible moral argument against distributing it to everybody? We seem to have an ethical imperative, not necessarily to force people to distribute code that they've written before they've ever distributed it, but that once something is being distributed, what's the argument against having it be distributed to everyone? Bruce Byfield is a journalist, writes a lot about free software, also had a nice way of putting this, that when you turn on your computer, you're making a political statement, and he describes the political statement that most people make if you're booting Microsoft Windows or Apple, that you are making a statement that it's okay for corporations to control access and filter our interactions with each other, which now occur using software so much in most parts of the world. And I think this is, this speaks to the ethical parallel to being a vegetarian and believing that it's just wrong to eat animals, no matter, you might even not eat animals even if it will be better for your health because you believe it's just wrong to do so. And I think that this statement really captures that it's an ethical choice that we make as individuals, and there's a right one, and at least, if you're not going to call it a wrong one, a choice with a lot of implications that are relatively invisible. And I think that the analogy is free software vegan and open source vegetarian. I think that what it's trying to get at is this part, this ethical reason. And that's when RMS explains the difference between free software and open source, he focuses a lot on how open source started. And he says it was originally proposed to avoid a possible misunderstanding of the term free software because of the confusion about free in price versus free as in freedom. But it soon became associated with a way of advocacy that did not talk about the ethical and social values, but focused strictly on the practical advantages of the software. So free software is called that because we want to put the focus on freedom. The beginnings of open source came from a belief that the same software could be promoted to people in more places, like business executives and companies, if we didn't talk about the social value of it and just talked about the tastes, the health implications, possibly the resource use, but focused on the practical aspects rather than the ethical ones. The ethical reasons certainly are challenging. So it's hard to avoid killing insects. In the book Bloodless Revolution, this quotes, we cannot walk one step, but probably we crush many insects creeping under our feet. Raising plants kills lots of insects and animals, not just insects. And in the world of free software, we have this problem that even if we personally directly try to only use free software, we end up encountering proprietary software and still using it everywhere. I mean, we draw a line at the Free Software Foundation around sort of the software that you directly control, but when you go use an ATM machine, you are still using proprietary software. If you make a phone call, your call is being transported across servers that use proprietary software. So that's one way of it. I saw a parallel here, but another one is the one that is under your control, but is almost as invisible as insects, and that's issues like proprietary JavaScript. So you might go through a lot of work to make sure that the operating system on your laptop is completely free software, but then you visit a web page, and you are right away served JavaScript, which is usually not properly and clearly licensed as free software. And you run that JavaScript program on your computer the same way as you run your word processor or the web browser to begin with, but you don't see it because the browser doesn't really tell you, hey, I'm a free browser, but this program that you just asked me to run is not free, it's proprietary. So to me, this is kind of like, I feel, during life at the FSF of trying really hard to avoid all proprietary software, so inadvertently stepping on bugs and accidentally killing things. So all we can do for the software that is under our control is get better at that. I'm comparing this to insects, but I think that the JavaScript issue is, in my worldview, much more significant in relative terms to software. The JavaScript program that some sites ask you to run is larger than the compiled version of GCC, right? Like, these are programs that are doing very significant things on your computer, and if you are a free software user, it's not that part you probably want to figure out how to pay attention to. And the rest seems to be a matter of just trying to improve the conditions around the world so that we don't interact with proprietary software in other ways outside of our control as much either. So the concern with ethics is why the Free Software Foundation mission is what it is, which is that we want all computer users to be able to do everything that they do on any computer using only free software. And this, I think, speaks to the spirit of that analogy, which is we want there ideally to be no proprietary software in the world. Other people who advocate free software don't necessarily agree on that goal. If you look at the list of reasons for advocating free software, you'll see some of them still allow for the existence of proprietary software in a way that a focus on ethics doesn't. So we have these reasons for doing what we want to do. Now it's sort of like and I've talked some about the directions of different kinds of solutions that those reasons lead us to. So the reason this is in the building community track is because we're trying to figure out how to sort of unify people who make the same choice for different reasons and work together in order to advance something that makes everybody happy for their respective reasons. And I think one of those things is labeling. So this is the image from the Leaping Bunny program by the Coalition for Consumer Information on Cosmetics. And this is something that you can get your cosmetic product certified as not having any direct animal testing. And then you get to display this mark. And then people who care about that can identify your product and support it. So this is something that it doesn't matter why you're trying to avoid animal testing. Whatever your reason is, you have to know whether a product was tested on an animal if you want to make avoid it for any reason. And I think that's why a focus on labeling is a good thing for the free software movement, because it's actually really challenging to look at a product in the store and figure out whether it's free software, whether it works with free software. because the definition of whether something is free software depends on a lot of answers to some legal questions, like what's the copyright license of the software, what is the EULA of the software, and much like reading a list of ingredients on a package of Twinkies, it's hard to know what those ingredients are and where they come from. So providing the service of certifying products is something that can appeal to people who want to use free software for whatever reason, but in order to do that, they have to know. This is one way to label a product about free software that contains free software, or open source, as it says. This product may contain material licensed to you under the GNU General Public License or other open source software licenses. Upon request, open source software source code is available at cost from Linksys for at least 3 years from the product purchase date. For detailed license terms and additional information, look at linksys.com/GPL. This reminds me of a cigarette warning, basically. This product contains chemicals known to the state of California to possibly cause cancer.
May contain this.
Yeah, may contain this. So this is it actually is helpful. Okay, like if you're looking for a product and you want to support a product that has free software in it, this tells you that it may have free software in it. This was added to Linksys routers in order to comply with the GPL after we sued them many years ago. But this is not the label of somebody that's trying to promote free software. Right? So we were looking for a different kind of label at the FSF, and so we arrived at this Respects Your Freedom logo. And similar to the Leaping Bunny program, it's a mark that we award to products as sold by particular retailers after we've evaluated them to make sure that they meet our criteria, and the focus of those criteria is to make sure that the product contains only free software and requires only free software. AJ?
Yeah, so on the last slide, the label says that source code is available for at least 3 years from the product purchase date.
Yeah.
How is that not a GPL violation?
Because they are taking, this is GPL v2 software, so this was before version 3 came out, and this is to comply with the written offer. They didn't want to ship the source code with the router, which is a shame because that's really the easiest way to comply with GPL. They wanted to go the other route allowed for in the license, which is to provide a written offer for source code. And the requirement is that that written offer be valid for at least some years after the product is sold. So from the last time the product is sold. And again, that's because this is, if you are wanting to support companies that are excited about participating in free software, this is a sign that even though it says it has free software, they're not really supporting the social cause of free software because they're only going to provide the source code for you for as long as they're required to. And after that, they're not really interested in providing it. So under this program, which you can read about fsf.org/RYF, we've certified routers, laptops, 3D printers, Wi-Fi adapters, and we have hopefully more coming on the way. And our goal is to have this mark actually printed on products, just like the Leaping Bunny mark is, or the Windows certified logo often is. So mostly so far, other companies are displaying it on their marketing materials or on their website, so next to the place where you can purchase the product online. But we do have actually just recently certified the first product that has the mark printed on it, which is pretty exciting. So this is a VPN router that's sold by Think Penguin. And they actually have the mark right there above the FCC certification and other government certifications. So this is what we want to see. We want to see something that enables people to care for whatever reason they choose to care. We're trying to provide the information so that people can then act on it. Other than labeling, we also think something that could help everybody, regardless of specific reason, is to try to raise the level of technological literacy. We've all heard the expression, give someone a fish or versus teach them to fishing, so I thought this is pretty good. Give someone a program, you frustrate them for a day, teach them how to program, you frustrate them for a lifetime. Something a lot of us can identify with, but really helping people understand what software does at some level, I think, is an important part of advocating free software for any reason, because you can't really, it's sort of like if you don't understand what source code is and how the basics about how that's turned into a program and what the difference between human readable code and non-human readable forms of that code is, then you can't really, it's sort of like knowing that food is something you put in your mouth, but not something that's made of ingredients that somebody mixed together before they gave it to you. Sort of like not understanding that a hamburger doesn't grow on a tree. Because if you don't understand that this wasn't just plucked from a tree, then you're not understanding the whole industrial process involved in producing a food product, or what goes on in kitchens. The fact that there are people back there with hair and like with colds, and if you don't understand literally how the sausage is made, then it's really hard to understand reasons you might want to care about particular aspects of that process or particular ways of distributing the final product. So, at the FSF, we certainly don't think that everybody needs to learn to become a programmer. There are people you don't want spending their time writing code. Heart surgeons and brain surgeons should be saving people's lives, not submitting patches to free software programs. But a certain level of literacy seems to be really important, just for enabling people to be able to seek help, to be able to anticipate the kinds of things that can be done in software, and to understand advocacy efforts that they might want to lend their support to along the way. And so we can help. I think a lot of people in this room can help other people improve their technical literacy. Can spend some time teaching things like that, publishing helpful documentation, and then there's lots of other things we can do as individuals to help promote free software. But the point I wanted to make here is that we should learn from other movements. Sometimes we don't spend enough time doing that. If you don't think about free software as a social movement, then of course there's not much reason to look at other social movements. But if you do, then looking at the lessons we can learn from movements like the vegetarian movement, which has been going on for hundreds of years, we can learn, and specifically in this case, from how to bring people together who are doing the same choice but for very different reasons. And besides focusing on efforts that appeal to a wide variety of reasons, we also need to be conscious of what each other's reasons are, I think. When I highlighted the difference between open source and free software, that difference was primarily about how things started. Now there are a lot of people who say open source when really they're talking about free software, and they're talking about the ethics even of the software. And this is confusing now, because it's no longer really as simple as free software versus open source. The open source initiative now even has the phrase software freedom on their front page, right? And they have a board of directors which has people who are publicly Free Software Foundation members and advocate for free software. So, I think for us at the FSF, we're still encouraging people to say free software and to talk about it in those terms, because it's the clearest thing to maintain, to give that signal that you care about the software for ethical reasons and for social reasons, and not just for reasons of taste or because the software is better, although those things are important too. So even though it doesn't mean that when someone says open source, they're automatically only talking about the functional reasons, someone who says free software is much more clearly emphasizing the social and ethical reasons. So even though things are changing, that's still a reason to adopt that term and to describe it with that language. But the other lesson is, if you want to know someone's reason for doing something, you need to ask them. So I think we need a lot more clear dialogue between people in the community about why they participate in free software, and pulling people together who participate in free software for the same reasons, and getting them working together on projects. So I think another lesson from all this is not to assume that just because someone says open source, they think a certain way. Actually ask them and have a discussion about it, and maybe it'll lead to interesting debates or collaboration. I do hope you will support the FSF. We do a lot of, describe some of the things that we do, like the labeling program. We do have our booth downstairs that you can stop by for a little bit during the raffle before things close up for the day. And by the way, I want to thank you all for still coming. I know a lot of the conference already had to leave earlier today, but thank you for sticking out for the last session here. We do survive on individual donations. About 80 to 85% of our funding every year is from individuals. We get some support from corporations, but primarily it's about individual members. So if you can manage to make that happen, we really appreciate it. And I would love to hear ideas that you have for us about the FSF is a high-profile advocate in this world, and the things that we say and do can have an impact. We have some resources to put behind things. So if you have ideas for what we can do to help people in your communities and your workplace, then I would love to hear about that.
So I was thinking that I think the word free is actually working against you. In the sense that, I mean, there seems to be a bit of a push right now saying that if you're not paying for a product, you are the product. And I think that if you went out into the general marketplace and looked at the word open source versus free, I think you'd find that probably open source has a higher recognition amongst people as being more kind of quality-based than free. Just an observation.
Yeah, so the language, I think we need research in this area because it seems intuitive that it's bad that free has multiple meanings and people can interpret it to mean free as in costs, and open source is at least something they're like, oh, I don't know what that is, and then they learn about it. But there's a few things to think about here. One is, I think this is more of a cultural problem than a language problem. So I keep seeing these cases where even with people who are using the term open source, they don't think that you can sell or make money off of somebody else's open source software. And there's still a common confusion where people set up open source against commercial, where people will say, we have commercial software and we have open source software at our company. Well, open source software has to be commercial software, otherwise it's not open source. If you're not allowed to, if someone tries to say that you can't distribute the software commercially, that's discrimination against the field of endeavor, and that makes that software not open source. It also makes it not free software. So there was another example is a thing that happened on Yahoo, or on Flickr a year or two ago. Flickr enables users to upload photos under a Creative Commons, under a couple of different Creative Commons licenses, and some of them allow commercial reuse. And so if you are uploading your photo to Flickr under one of those licenses, like Creative Commons, UISA, the attribution share-alike license, somebody else can download that photo and sell it. And Yahoo announced that they were going to start doing that with some of the photos that were licensed to allow them to do that on Flickr. And people got really mad at it because they didn't realize that this license that they used allowed other people to commercially make use of their work. So I keep coming back to the fact that I don't think this is a problem. And then one more thing to say is that open source is being used in a variety of very confusing ways. So people talk about open source journalism, which has almost nothing to do with the principles of the open source definition, other than that it's often like crowdsourced and done by individuals rather than big companies, but it's not usually under actual free license terms. It's not like people describing something as open source journalism are talking about stories that can be freely copied and shared commercially and non-commercially by other news outlets. They're mostly just talking about it being produced in a collaborative fashion. So open source is also having a lot of problems with meaning. People are misusing the term to talk about hardware devices that actually come with proprietary software. So I think our main issue here is not language, but about the cultural contexts. And we have to change people's minds about what they should expect, what they can expect, what they should demand, can demand, more than worry as much about. No term is going to give us an automatic solution to those things, basically.
So, in terms of the mark that you guys have now, the freedom mark, what else are you guys doing in terms of anti-spyware, anti-tracking, as we kind of get to this next generation of source code may be free, but our data and our privacy is being sold and tracked and managed? What is the Free Software Foundation doing, to address that?
So we part of the Respects Your Freedom certification does include a couple of security-related points. We don't represent that we do a full security audit of the products that we've certified, but we say that we look for a set of basic things, and then also say that if any bad behavior is discovered and not fixed, quickly, then we'll decertify the product. So it's not, we're not trying to be a secure computer mark, but we do have that kind of baked into the criteria. But also, so we had Edward Snowden keynote our conference, Libre Planet, back in March. Not in person, of course, but because it was in Boston, not Russia. But the video is up online on media.libreplanet.org, and that was a great talk that he did specifically for our conference, which was tuned towards free software concerns. And so that's part of what we're doing. It's just, we got 400 people together to hear that and to talk about it, and then made the recording available. We have the email self-defense guide that I mentioned. The GNU project has a browser called GNU IceCat, which is based on Firefox, but has different settings that are tuned towards privacy and security and helping users deal with proprietary JavaScript. So, it's a little bit tricky for us because our main message is that free software is a precondition for security and privacy, but it doesn't guarantee security or privacy. Free software has security bugs too. Free software can transmit your information without telling you. If you don't look at the code yourself, you won't know. But there's no way that you can ever trust a proprietary program because you're just always taking the word of the developer. So we just want to get that message across, that it's the precondition to any of the other changes that people want to make in order to feel secure about their computing. But there's a lot more specific kinds of development work that need to be done after that initial choice of having all the software be free too.
How can you push back against companies that release what they call free software, but it's crippled without them building it? I'm speaking specifically of Google.
So I guess that the first thing that comes to mind is the literacy thing that I was talking about. So we need more people to care about situations where that's true, and to that involves learning a certain set of skills. And we've talked with the FSF about setting up some seminars and tutorials about how to learn skills, like how to build software. Because if we don't have that, then people sort of don't recognize that as unfriendly behavior. That doesn't necessarily make the software non-free. It depends on if the distributor that you're talking about is the copyright holder, then they can, they don't have any obligation to make sure that you can build the software. If they're distributing somebody else's GPL-covered software, then they do have some obligation to make sure that you're able to build the source code. So our main two efforts on that are wanting to raise the literacy level in general and wanting to enforce the GPL where we're able to do that when it's companies that are doing that with other people's code and getting the advantage of the freedoms of the GPL but not passing those on to other people. I do think you have to be careful about mixing up the concerns. So we heard this a lot in the debate about System D, where people thought the software was too complicated and hard to understand, and that made it in some sense non-free.
Well, I'm speaking of keys.
Keys.
Google's operating system signed with developer keys that and you can't use many features of the operating system if you do not have those keys.
Is that for Chrome OS?
Yeah.
Yeah, Chrome.
So like updating
Yeah, right.
But wait, Chrome OS you can use your own keys though, and build your own version.
Yeah, you lose a lot of capability though.
There's community builds that you can update and they're pretty Chrome OS-y already. I'm not sure what features are missing.
I think this is it's an important issue though, because so with Chrome you can put it into on a Chromebook anyway, you can put it into developer mode and make changes, or in different kinds of computers they're coming with secure boot enabled, which is a similar. So the computer is configured to only boot signs code, and the signature has to come from a recognized authority. And right now, the number of authorities that are recognized by default is very limited, basically VeriSign working with Microsoft. So as long as the user can install their own keys and remove other people's keys, and can therefore sign a new operating system image and install that, then the basic freedoms are respected. But we have cases where that's not true for sure. So Apple devices, ARM tablets like the Surface, don't allow you to replace the operating system with your own. And then we do have a more pragmatic concern, which is how does this interfere with people's ability to buy a computer at the store and take it home and install GNU Linux on it? So we have to be careful about that and make sure that companies aren't making aren't doing things that, even though aren't technically infringing on user freedom, are making it really hard to spread free software. And that's part of why we need the certification mark and those kinds of programs, because we just have to get past this point of like trying to take hardware that people sold without user freedom, and coming with software without user freedom really in mind, and then trying to like replace it, even though that's not really what they intended us to do. So we really need to be able to go to stores, shop online, and buy hardware that already comes with software that we're supposed to be able to modify. So I think that's the long-term solution. Gosh, I think we're about time to raffle, I think. Thanks, everybody.